we are going to provide you with a basic primer of the education policy landscape and process, so that those of you who are here have that understanding of how education policy is created and implemented and how it moves, so that you can effectively and appropriately communicate with the right people who can make change on your issue, your stances on and your asks for policymakers on education. So we're gonna start with an opening presentation actually by Arise from Rhode Island, who are going to go through their local and community-based advocacy, and then jump into an education policy overview by yours truly that'll focus more on the high-level federal policy landscape, so that we cover, all of those levels of policy making, from the local and community level to the federal, and then jump right into a Know Your Legislator workshop to get everybody practicing how to frame your issue so that it appeals the most to the policymaker that you're speaking, and really try to persuade them of your cause. And then if we have time, hopefully, break everybody out into small groups to practice on your own that process of reframing your issue, and then reconvene and close. And with that, I'm actually going to end my screen share and kick it off to Arise for their opening presentation. Stop share. All right, kick it away, Arise.
Right. Just give me a moment while I share my screen. Are you all able to see this? Hold up. Yep.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right. So, Gur, whenever you're ready.
Right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Gur Lee. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm with Arise, and this is our presentation on leadership and organizing. I am also introducing two other youth that are speaking with me.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Nancy Xiong, and I'm a lead organizer with Arise. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'll pass it on to Deja.
My name's Deja, and I'm a youth activist for Arise, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I was a part of the founding cohort of Arise.
So what is Arise?
So Arise stands for the Alliance of Rhode Island Southeast Asians for Education, and our mission is to prepare, promote, and empower Rhode Island Southeast Asian students for educational and career success. Our vision is to help the Southeast Asian community that is a healthy, thriving, and able to reach its full potential by being engaged in developing socially responsible members in their community. So under Arise, we have a lot of culturally responsive programs and support. And down below, you could see a graph that splits up the different programs into categories. So the first one is civic responsibility and social consciousness. The next is academic preparedness, then pathways to the future, then post-secondary access and readiness, and finally, families and intergenerational leadership. And as we go further on into the presentation, we'll go more into depth behind these programs.
So before we actually dive deep into the work that we do, we're going to do a quick Menti. So if you all can pull up your phones or another tab on your laptop, and you can just search menti.com and then enter the code 4083587. And the first question is, what does youth organizing look like? Okay, first one, empowerment. Yup, for sure. Empower students shaping the policies that impact their lives. Yes, definitely. Yup, loving these responses. Yup. Love the healing in action.
I see purpose, that's a good one.
Yep.
Organizing that centers our future generation, that one's good too.
Self-care, definitely, for sure. Definitely. Love all these responses. So the next mentee question that we have is, what is youth power? And what does that look like to you? Leadership. Okay. Fresh ideas. Feel free to come off mute too if you want to explain yourself more, because I know you're just typing in a box and there might be a limited amount of words. Ooh. Rising ownership of society. Letting go of social constructs and claiming the future.
Standing in solidarity. Reimagination, that one's good too.
Ooh.
The ability to see bigger picture without corruption of individualism, capitalism, or colonialism.
Yep. Okay. Passionate enthusiasm for things that matter to them. Definitely. Okay. So we're just going to go back to our presentation. If you feel free at any time, if you want to add on, feel free to just type it in the chat and we will definitely take a look at it later. So thank you all for sharing your responses to the mentee and just like hearing different other perspectives that people put on their thoughts on what youth organizing and what youth power is. Now we're gonna dive deeper into our advocacy and activism work in Arise and with the community. So this past year, and since December of 2019, Arise has been part of a coalition called PASS, the Province Alliance for Student Safety. And it was formed by 3 organizations, Arise being one of them. And as you all can see below, those are the youth organizations in Providence that also joined us. And we all came together to demand more support for students and to get SROs, also known as school resource officers, out of Providence schools. And hopefully that'll create a chain and create pathways for other schools and youth to take SROs out. And with this, we have a Counselors Not Cops campaign. We have 3 demands. Our first demand is removing SROs from schools. Our second demand is to focus on mental health of students. And then the third demand is to implement safety teams instead of SROs and implement restorative justice.
So partnered with PASS and continuing on with the Counselors Not Cops campaign, Arise joined a coalition called Our Schools PVD, which is a group of other youth organizations together that Nancy just mentioned. And Our Schools PVD was founded to combat the Rhode Island Department of Education's takeover of the Providence Public School District. And we work to gain political power, decision-making power, and influence policy. We value collaboration, shared vision, sharing ideas and resources, and we center youth voice and leadership. We bring a lot of organizing and social and emotional development to the table while working with teachers and trying to understand schools. We also do policy and legal analysis with historical framework. And as of right now, we have about 1,000 people working in this coalition. So part of our school's PVD, we value these three things: democracy, dollars, and dignity. Democracy being that we need a say, a voice, and decision-making power, while with dollars, we need adequate and equitable resources. And finally, with dignity, we need cultures, classrooms, and curricula of respect.
So following along with what Deja had mentioned, we also have visions at the very start of our school's PVD. We had a theory of change, like, what are root causes of these educational problems? How are we going to get it done? And, most importantly, how are we going to work as a community to change what we envision? With this in mind, we envision a school filled with a safe and healthy environment with supportive teachers and mental health counselors. There are some youth in this campaign, for example, like me and Deja, and we do this work for the sake of future generations that will be attending the same schools as we once did. So what can we do for everlasting change? Number one, we need to stay true to the change. With powerful changes in schools, we would need to maintain it and make sure that all students have access to educational equity. Number two, changing the system. In order to change the system, producing programs and institute progressive policies for students will change how the school system works. And lastly, change power relationship and leadership. Building power and maintaining change will be hard, but by selecting new leaders in the education department and having youth help with choices, we will accomplish change within our own school system.
So continuing on with the education theme, Arise partnered with PRISM, helped pass the All Students Count Act, which makes Rhode Island the third state to pass this act. This disrupts the model minority myth by exposing the hidden educational disparities faced by Southeast Asian students. And without it, it denies Southeast Asian students access to resources supporting their educational success.
So continuing on with all the work that Arise Youth and Arise in general being in the community, we've also been involved in a lawsuit case where we're suing the state, suing the governor, because the state officials have not fulfilled their duty to ensure that students are getting the education they need to adequately prepare for success as adults and as citizens of America. And with that, recently we won an award called the New England First Amendment Award. And these illustrations was made by our artistic organizer, who was a founding youth leader as well, Malate Sog.
With the fight for education, Arise also believes that ethnic studies is important. In 2018, Arise partnered up with a variety of schools in Rhode Island and taught more than just the basic Eurocentric history. Many students had the chance and opportunity to learn about their own history and Southeast Asian history. With ethnic studies, young adults become more socially conscious about other cultures and their hardships.
So along with everything that we've been doing with and for the community, we also have a youth leadership program. With a total of 19 youth leaders, we recently moved on to a virtual platform using Zoom to meet every Monday and Wednesday, where we have political education trainings and where we focus on self-care and self-love. And as you all can see, here are some pictures in our space where we have things to remind us of why we're doing this work and to make sure that we're not being burnt out. Because in order for us to fight against the oppressors, we need to continue to have the energy and to continue taking care of ourselves. Like how I said earlier, we also focus on a healing center space to foster social emotional learning, because in order for us to be the best of ourselves, we need to heal, find a sense of healing, and to build together.
Arise also educates and empowers youth of color on more than just using their voice. We help increase self-efficacy and make sure that youth become more socially conscious. Arise also offers a summer program called Hidden Lotus, in which youth become vulnerable, experience a chance to meet new people, and learn about things they never did in school. And not only that, but we offer many other programs through a social justice lens. Teaching young adults about self-efficacy and social consciousness makes them more aware of the world that they are living in and the changes that they can do. So how can you get involved? By following us on social media to stay up to date on what we are doing. Not only that, but you guys can go to our website and become monthly sustainers and donate to help youth development and many more youth who are just like us. By becoming a monthly sustainer, you are helping the organization grow bigger and helping youth become more vocal in our communities. Thank you so much for your time. And if there's any question or comments, we would gladly love to answer them.
So feel free to type your questions in the chat or just come off mute, and we'll be here to answer them. I'm also going to stop sharing my screen. Okay, so if you all don't have any questions, okay, I see some questions now. So the first question is, how do you go about recruiting youth to be part of your organization strategies? Gur and Deja, do you both want to talk more about this since you both are youth?
Yeah, I can talk about it.
Okay.
So one way that we reach out to the youth is by having someone come that represents Arise, come inside of schools such as Classical and Central and PCTA. And we come and we sit down and we talk to the students during lunch to try to get them more involved and try to get them to come to the programs. And when they come to the table to talk to us about the certain programs and what Arise does, we have them put down their email. So we have a way to contact them to let them know about any future things that Arise is doing so they can stay in contact with us and stay up to date. And strategies, I definitely would have to say mainly all of us are teenagers, so something that helps connect you with the teenagers and with the youth definitely makes it more impactful and would make them want to come back.
How has it changed during the pandemic? I was the one that asked the question.
Yeah. So like we actually worked very hard for that. We had an info session. We blasted this on social media with flyers. We asked our current youth leaders to also blast it on social media to their friends and to their schools networks. And we hosted an info session through Zoom. And then after that, we had an orientation in person to build trusting relationships, where we stood by the COVID precautions. Right. So the next question is, what is the current status of the lawsuit? So right now we're waiting for another meeting with the judge to see where their status is at. And then we'll move from there. But because of COVID, things has also changed. The next question is, what have you found to be most effective in mobilizing and educating your peers? Gur and Deja, do you both want to?
Yeah, I could speak upon that. So I feel like the most effective way that we teach our peers is definitely through like physical activities and just basic examples that we see throughout everyday life. And I feel like that's just because a lot of students are more of a physical learner than a visual. So we just feel like physical learning is probably the most important, and it's just really hands-on. So I feel like that's how we educate our peers. That's how I feel that it effectively works.
I see a question that says, I'm curious to know the impact of the youth leadership programs after students graduate, and do you have any stories you could share? Nancy, do you want to talk about that since you just
Yeah.
graduated?
So I actually graduated high school in 2019, and I'm still in the Rise. As you all can see, I'm a lead organizer with our Rise, and the impact was definitely amazing because during my whole life, I always hated being Hmong. I hated my culture. I hated speaking the language a lot because my history wasn't taught in schools. And in Rhode Island, there's not a big culture. There's not a big Hmong population either. So I had a very big, huge identity crisis during middle school and high school till I found a Rise. And because I found that space and because I felt a sense of community, like, wow, like my culture does matter. Hmong people are actually, we are resilient as our other Southeast Asian communities, and just to be able to continue doing that work and to hopefully change that with the next generations to value our ancestors and what we've been through was definitely is what keeps me here. Right. Gina, feel free to let us know when our time is up because I don't know how much time we're taking.
We have about 5 more minutes, so we can take a
Okay.
few more questions.
All right. I see a question here. Are you often approached by other organizations for collaborations? In Providence, we definitely do a lot of collaboration. Like you all
Definitely.
heard in the presentation, we are involved in campaigns, and basically we work with like almost every youth organization out there in Rhode Island. And it also depends on our capacity. Sorry.
And then I see another question that says, has your organization faced ageism in youth-led work? And if so, how did you address those instances? As a youth that's been a part of Arise since the very beginning, there has been a lot of ageism, but not from Arise, definitely from other places that we have been or we had presented or we had to do workshops with. And we address those by basically stating that this is a youth-led space and that they need to respect the fact that youth are the main voices for Arise. And we also have the ED who backs us up a lot and makes sure that the youth are up front in most of what we do. And she's normally there, Shonda, to back us up. And it's very much all youth-led.
Yeah, and like coming from like an adult perspective, like it's important that all the staff workers understand that there is a power dynamic because of our age, and to try to limit that as much as possible, which is why we take time in like building relationships with the young people and to get to know them personally. Okay. Which 3 states have the law passed? I can get back to you about that, Jennifer.
So it's just because I had the answer on hand, sorry to cut in. It's Minnesota, Washington, and Rhode Island. California only does it for health, but not for education. And then Hawaii has always done it, but it's just because Hawaii is inherently such a multi-ethnic state, and they've always just kind of done their own thing in terms of their education system. So those 3 are where they're currently disaggregating student data.
Thank you.
All right. Yes. Do we have time for one more question or?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
So feel free to come off mute.
So Vachana, if you can let us know if you're unable to unmute yourself, and then we can do it for you here. But if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Great. Very good afternoon. I'm from Long Beach and I'm Cambodian. Once again, I'm very happy that you create all of this youth organization to help facilitating, diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I hope that they will contribute to better understanding among ourselves. But, as I'm an older generation, I found it not externally, but I found like nowadays I have difficulty engage, with the young generation here because my view and their view are totally uh, not together. I mean, they, before they do anything, they like to text, they like to call, they like to do everything via the digital. And me, I like to interact with people to see face to face because I feel like I'm a human being. I may be old fashioned, but I think we need to nurture that capacity as a human to interact, to do things that we think is best for the benefit of us. When we eat dinner now, I notice that the kids are concerning about much more on Facebook, social media, responding instead of enjoying life. What is your organization? Your organization help is a gapping the difference between the elder and the youth today, and I think it would be a big help nowadays. Because uh, we all have a place in this world. It was a generational change, and I think if you start neglecting elder, I think it will impact you as well in the long run, because all of us have something to offer, and together, you mentioned about collaboration, you're talking about equity, but can the elder, I have many monk professor from Portland State, Dr. Tao from Portland State University, and we always share some teaching about how the elder uh, are not included in the youth nowadays. So how your organization find a way to gap this kind of difference? Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much as an elder for speaking up about this. And it is a struggle that we're dealing with as well. But recently we had two events that focus on census to make sure that our hard to count communities get counted, where many elders were involved as well. For example, my mom, she was included in the process of like making sure that there were vegetables at our event, because we're doing like care packages and we provided like vegetables in these bags for the community. So that's how my mom got included with this. And also when we have our youth in our spaces, we also talk to the parents because we know that they're also underage, and whatever we do and whatever, like wherever we bring them outside of the space, it's the responsibility is on us. So we want to build that relationship with parents and have that sense of community.
Also, as someone that's mixed with Cambodian, I struggle with getting what we're doing across to the elders. My grandfather, he's very big and with the Khmer community in Rhode Island, so we always reach out to him to let the elders know about what Arise is doing. And Arise also makes sure that whenever we have an event or we're letting out information, we have interpreters that can break down what we're saying in different languages, and we make sure that the Asian community is well centered.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what they just said, and I also agree with what John said in here about, how language barrier is like, a major thing when it comes to communication through, a younger generation and an older generation. I could speak upon that myself because, my mom and dad, they came from Laos and, they didn't know how to speak English. So it's like, and they still don't, and for a first generation in the US and, you know, communicating with them, I do know Hmong, so I do communicate with them when I speak Hmong, and I try to, you know, speak as much as I can with them. But, you know, over time, I did started losing some of my Hmong, and it's kind of broken now, but I try my best. And that's probably like one of the biggest issues, you know, is that, you know, there's a big language barrier between both younger generation and older generation.
Just to tie this in, like why we do this work, right? Why I do this work, because we need to hold on to our roots and also remember the struggles and the trauma that our ancestors went through for us to be here where we are today. And I think we went over time, but yeah, I'm so sorry.
No, don't be, not at all. That was a really, really powerful discussion and a presentation. So thank you so much, Arise. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Deja. Thank you, Gur. Thank you so much for your power and your commitment to the work and to justice, and for really just being the youth-led change that our world needs. And so with that, let me just pivot really quickly to share my screen. All right. Awesome. So again, thank you so much, Arise. If anybody else has questions that you want to ask Arise, please absolutely feel free to submit them in the chat box, and then Gina or somebody on CRC staff is going to collect all the questions at the end of the session, both in terms of Arise's presentation or anything that I'm going to say next. And we'll absolutely make sure to get to them via email after the session sometime next week if we're not able to address your question today during the session. So again, please absolutely feel free to use the chat box for anything. And with that, I am going to start the rest of our training. So Arise Youth Leaders gave us a really powerful account of what community youth-led change looks like. That's both in terms of course, the work that they're doing inside their schools to influence school policy, but also district policy with Providence Public Schools, and also state policy at the Rhode Island State House. And just, I think that their account is a powerful testimony to just how much power communities have to make change in their communities. But I want to know, like, you know, the federal government also exists too, and Congress is inundating the news with what it's doing, what it's not doing. And so in terms of how we can be advocates for education at all levels of governance, I really want to take this time now to just give a brief top-level overview of how education policy interacts at the federal level, so that those of y'all who are here today, you know, you've heard this incredible testimony and account of how community change is happening, but also you have the tools to how to interact with your federal policymakers as well to really affect that change. How do I, here we go. So in this brief overview, we're going to go through the key education agencies at all the state, local, and federal levels, as well as some of the key federal laws that serve as the backdrop to decisions about what and how students learn in schools. And then identify some federal opportunities for advocacy, as well as CRAC's stances on some of those advocacies currently and in the past, and just ways that you can advocate in that space as well. So education policy is really created and implemented at these three levels. There's the local, I'm gonna start from bottom to top, I apologize, but there's the local education agency or the school district, which is responsible for actually operating public schools, including how money's spent, who that money goes to, like which schools, teacher hiring and other personnel decisions, teacher professional development, curricula such as ethnic studies, and more. Really the meat of like what happens inside the classroom. Then you have the state education agencies, otherwise known as departments of education or education commissions. These state departments supervise state and federal education laws, distribute state and federal resources like funding, and provide guidance to public schools and districts on just how to operate. And then there's the federal government. which consists of the US Congress and the US Department of Education. The federal government uses a combination of funding and then policy guidance attached to that funding and political influence to try to shape like what and the how students learn in classrooms. But they can't actually create that directly. So Congress will create and renew these federal programs and provide the funding to which they tie a bunch of requirements to try to shape what happens in classrooms. And then the US Department of Education supervises those laws and then administers the programs. The federal government, in terms of like how schools are funded, provides about 10% on average of a school's funding sources. The remaining 90% come from state and local revenues. And so when you think about it in terms of dollar amounts, the federal government doesn't really do it, it's only about 10%, but that 10% accounts for a lot because the funding that 10% covers is very often directly targeted to the students who are most in need and who require additional services. And there are also some critical civil rights related standards or requirements attached to that funding that states and districts have to meet in order to get it. And so it's very much like a conditional funding, and they're able to exert a lot of influence that way. That influence takes place through some federal laws, including, it takes place through federal laws. And a big one in the K-12 space is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, otherwise known as the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, which is the most current iteration of this bill that's been around since the 1960s. It's the primary source of federal aid for K-12 education. And as a condition for receiving this funding, it holds states, school districts, and public schools accountable for keeping track of and improving outcomes for all students and eliminating any disparities that that exist between certain subgroups of students. And to receive those federal funds, every state has to submit like a big state accountability plan to the US Department of Education and get that approved. And what that state plan outlines is how exactly they're going to they're going to close these disparities, how they're going to monitor education and make sure that everybody is learning. Within ESSA are these different titles or like sections or programs, and the biggest of these is Title I, the very first program. It says programs for disadvantaged students, students assessment, migratory students, and neglected and delinquent students. Essentially, it's the biggest amount of money that's a part of ESSA, and it really goes to low-income students and school districts. It's based on a head count of how many students are under the low-income bucket, and then it's, that money is supposed to be used to specifically support underserved students without necessarily like taking place of any funding that a state or school district should already be spending on these students as part of their education funding system. In addition to Title I, there's also all these other various titles that do different things. Title III is a big one that CRAC works on, which is for English, to support English learners. You can see Title II has some programs and funding for teacher and professional development. There's more details about ESSA in a kind of resource that we'll be sharing after this session and after this particular presentation. So if you want to learn more about ESSA, please absolutely feel free to look through that. A big thing that ESSA did was kind of identify different subgroups of students that each state and school district and school is supposed to be held accountable for the success of. I hate to use the term achievement, which is like how the federal government kind of says it, but it makes it seem as if like some students achieve less than others. So I'm gonna make a disclaimer now that the language that I'm using in this presentation is not necessarily going to be reflective of the language that's actually in policy, because I don't think that's actually very doesn't reflect the reality of students. And so we've got economically disadvantaged students, roughly measured by eligibility for FRPL or the free lunch program, students with disabilities, English learners, major racial and ethnic groups, which are those 7 on the slide, some states, and we just talked about this, but specifically Washington, Minnesota, and Rhode Island, disaggregate their education data further than these 7 major racial and ethnic groups, but it's very much for state purposes. And what ends up happening with that data that is more detailed, when they report it to the federal government, it ends up being aggregated because the federal government does not have a standard of disaggregated race and ethnicity data for any data that's being looked at in the Department of Ed. So that's what we have. We're advocating to change that. In the post-secondary education space, we've got the Higher Education Act, or the HEA. The HEA primarily provides financial aid to help students and families pay for college education. And it also provides that financial support to institutions of higher education to help them serve their students better as well. There are also other programs such as grants to improve teacher ed programs or to provide financial support to institutions that serve particularly high numbers of underserved students and others. These are some of the titles or programs that are a part of the HEA. One that I want to highlight in particular are Titles 3 and Title 5, Strengthening Institutions and Developing Institutions, because those are 2 titles where there is funding appropriated or authorized for the AANAPISIS program, which is the Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander Serving Institutions program, which is part of the Minority Serving Institutions program, and it's intended to help institutions with high numbers of API students to better serve them. And then the last big major federal law that I want to highlight is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. This law provides federal funding for the education of children with disabilities. And as a condition for receiving federal IDEA funding, schools have to provide students with disabilities with a free, appropriate public education. And what that, part of free, appropriate public education is to guarantee that special education students and students with disabilities are educated in the least restrictive environment as possible, so as much in the general classroom as possible, and that they're provided with special education services to help them succeed in school, just like everybody else. Some of the federal, or some of the opportunities for advocating at the federal level that CRAC is involved in and is a part of our education portfolio are in these 3 areas. It's in the Higher Education Act, in federal appropriations, and the enforcement for civil rights. Why we have that Higher Education Act in here is, and why we've been focusing on that in the last couple of years and will continue to do so, is actually because the Higher Education Act as it currently stands technically expired in 2014. These big bills, ESSA, HEA, IDEA, they all have to be renewed every so often. And that's why, the ESSA is now called ESSA. It's the same, kind of like bill, kind of like law, but it got renewed into something called ESSA back in 2015. In the same way, the Higher Education Act is up for being renewed. However, Congress remains at a disagreement about what should be in the bill. And so there's an opportunity there for advocates, advocacy orgs or advocates to make sure that Southeast Asian American students' needs and priorities are included in any reauthorization of that law. Another opportunity is in appropriations. Every year, Congress passes a spending package that provides funding and money and dollars to all of the federal programs, including education programs. And so CRAC has, for the last few years, submitted our own appropriations requests, just highlighting key programs that we want to make sure are fully funded or actually see an increase in funding, such as like an increase in funding for the Office of English Language Acquisition in the U.S. Department of Education, or more money for the AANAPISIS program to make sure that AAPI students in higher education are better served by their institutions, and so on. And so that's an annual process, and one that can get really confusing and wonky, but there's certainly an opportunity there to keep pushing for more funding to be allocated for the Southeast Asian American community. And another opportunity is in the creation and enforcement of laws for civil rights. The thing with these big federal bills is that there's a really critical role they play in maintaining and enforcing student civil rights. The laws as they're currently in place, they set certain standards that states or districts or colleges or schools have to meet in providing every student with an education. These laws aren't perfect, and there's a lot that can be improved in there to make sure that all students have access to a high quality education. But as they are there to really protect and make sure that all students have access to the education systems that are there. And there's a whole nother conversation we can have about whether or not the system is even fair to begin with. But as of now, like, the federal government really is that civil rights entity. And so there's a lot of ongoing monitoring of and advocacy for making sure that these civil rights protections remain in place and are strengthened as the years go on. So those are 3 areas that we've been working on at CRAC. And if you want to get involved, you can always reach out to CRAC and see if there are ways that you can get involved as an advocate for at the federal level for each of these opportunities. So with that, I know there might be questions about this portion of the presentation. Unfortunately, we are running a little bit over time. And so what I'm gonna ask everybody to do is to just continue to submit any questions to the chat box, and then we'll try to just bulk go through them at the end, or follow up individually after the session to connect you to the right people to get those questions answered. So now we've got this basis, idea of how education policy is created and enforced and implemented. And then we've also, sorry, let me start that over. Now that we have that baseline understanding of education policy and governance, I wanna work with y'all to really think about how we can advocate to the federal government and to policymakers and to legislators. And so what we're gonna do is actually build on something that, if you were present for the health session yesterday with COM, build on one of the sections that COM really highlighted as something that's important to do when you're trying to meet with your legislator and advocate to your legislator. And that's really just knowing your legislator and being able to frame your issue around their priorities in a way to make to make that really appealing to them and to persuade them of why they should support your issue. We're going to use a case study, in this case, Congressman Bobby Scott of Virginia, and work through a particular issue that is a priority of CRAC's, as an example of how when CRAC meets with federal legislators, how we try to make our issues as relevant and as appealing as possible. So, Congressman Bobby Scott, he represents the 3rd Congressional District of Virginia. His district is safely Democrat. It's predominantly Black and white. And as of the most recent population estimates available to us on the Census Bureau's website, there are no estimates for Southeast Asian Americans or APIs currently. That just means that the population is too small in his district to report on in a statistically valid or, privacy security-wise manner. Perhaps that may change with the 2020 census, and that's why you should all fill out the census and encourage your community members to do the same. Now, Congressman Bobby Scott is the chairman of the House Education and Labor Committee. That means he's a part of leadership, and he also sits on the Budget Committee, as well as 2 very important caucuses, the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, the CDC and KPAC. Now, when we look at his, when we try to analyze his priorities in education policy, it's important to note that as the chairman of the Education and Labor Committee, Congressman Scott does tend to look at legislation more often with an eye towards how it will impact the country, the national impact, rather than specifically his district in Virginia. You'll frequently see with your elected official or with members of Congress that they're very committed to making sure that legislation has a positive impact on their district. However, as a member of House leadership and as a chairman of the committee, he does have a responsibility to think of how nationally bills will impact the country And his committee is also responsible not just for education, but for policies that serve working people and families. And so as a result, some of his education positions, and this is just my read of it as like the education policy manager at CIRAC, but I personally found some of his education positions to therefore also include a focus on supporting working people and workforce development, and just kind of like melding those together. Some major pieces of legislation that he has pushed in the 116th Congress, which is from 2019 to 2020, are the College Affordability Act, which is his his version of a renewal of the HEA, the Rebuild America Schools Act of 2019, which is a school infrastructure bill, the Child Care for Working Families Act, which is exactly what it sounds like, and then another bill called the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act of 2019. I mentioned this last bill because there was a vote on it in the House last week. It's not a bill that CIRAC is working on. It's pretty like legalese heavy. It has nothing to do with the private right of action in the context of education. So unfortunately, I can't describe it in too great of a detail now, but I did want to just acknowledge that that was a pretty big bill that was in consideration quite recently, and it is Congressman Scott's bill. And if you would like to learn more about it, please absolutely feel free to reach out to me about this at some point, and I'll make sure that information gets passed on to you. So now we want to frame our issue for Congressman Scott. And the issue is that we want more funding for AANAPISIS. Here I have a quick, for those of you who are familiar with the idea of a message box, this is what that is. If not, that's fine. All this is just that, you know, we have a vision. We want to make sure that students of color, such as Southeast Asian Americans, who are underserved by higher education, they should be able to pursue their academic and educational goals at programs that are supportive of them and they're high quality. But the problem is that some of these opportunities can be very inaccessible to Southeast Asian Americans, or, you know, higher ed just tends to shut out a lot of students generally. And there's a solution to that, is to invest in the AANAPISIS program, which exists to help institutions better serve their AAPI and low-income students by providing funding to increase their capacity to do exactly that. And so now we have an action. We want to ask Congressman Scott to please increase funding for the AANAPISIS program. Now I'm going to go back a few slides. Congressman Scott does not come from a district that has a high population of AAPIs. So why would he care about this issue? Well, let's break it down. When we want to frame this issue of increasing funding for AANAPISIS to somebody like Congressman Scott, we got to look at three things: alignment with policy priorities, any previous legislation he's championed, and maybe even caucus affiliation too. As I've mentioned, Congressman Scott, as chairman, is committed to making college more affordable. So this next part, if you're reading the slide, I just took that directly off of the Committee on Education and Labor website. But you know, he's chairman of this committee, and this committee is wants to increase the quality of higher ed and expand opportunities for all students. And AANAPISIS do exactly that. In fact, research has shown that AANAPISIS and other MSIs contribute to students' economic upward mobility and provide more resources to students of color who are low income than programs that are not part of the MSI program. You can also look at prior legislation. He has championed the College Affordability Act, which would actually increase mandatory funding from $5 million to $6 million to AANAPISIS. And that's a huge, giveaway that he might be persuaded to continue to, support funding increases for the AANAPISIS program. And if you look at caucus affiliation, he's a member of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, and AANAPISIS are a huge priority for the caucus. I do want to also make a note, though, going back quickly to the policy priorities, why I chose to emphasize the economic upward mobility aspect than something that's more qualitative, such as the fact that AANAPISIS provide culturally responsive experiences, or they can provide spaces that are affirming of marginalized identities. That's because his legislative stances, if you look at the bills that he's put out, or the bills that he's co-sponsored, and the bills that he's brought onto the committee to consider, they've really leaned towards the economic and workforce benefits of higher education to students of color, more so than any qualitative benefits like affirming marginalized identities and cultural responsiveness. And so just looking at the legislative record, you can kind of see like, how can we frame this issue that is like totally valid on multiple fronts in a way that is most appealing to this legislator? So, questions. I have a timeline here of how quickly I was supposed to get through some things, and we are actually on time. So I'm going to open up the chat box to questions that you have, either about the substantive content part of, like, you know, the very, very top level overview of education policy, or any questions you have about the know your legislator, tailor your message part of this. And so again, if you have any questions or have had questions, I can see that the chat box is already full. Please continue to submit them, and I'll give about 6 minutes to answer any questions, and then break us all out into small groups to actually practice tailoring your own message for your member of Congress on your own. And I will tell you which issue that you're gonna work around. And for, I think that for everybody who registered, you should have gotten the Know Your Legislator worksheet, which was totally optional. If you did that for your member of Congress, feel free to use that during the breakout session to try practice tailoring your message to that person. If not, we've already discussed Congressman Scott, so you can try, you know, workshopping this, you know, framing your issue with the example of Congressman Scott. So with that, I have the chat box open. Let's see if anybody's got some questions. Oh, you guys like have so many affirmations. This is great. So Priscilla asks, what sort of information do you look at when making this analysis? So Priscilla, I'm actually going to put you on the spot and ask if you are able to unmute yourself just to clarify your question. Which analysis are you referring to?
Hi, yeah, this was when you were talking about like framing your issue to ensure your legislator will care about it. Your slide kind of mentioned it, but yeah, I just wanted to hear more about like specific things that you look for when you're trying to frame your issue.
Absolutely. And I will be sure to include some of the resources that I'm going to talk about now in a follow-up email, but Congress.gov is like the clearinghouse for all of the legislation that a member of Congress has introduced or supported. So Congress.gov is a great resource just to look at their legislative record. You can also just go directly onto their website. So it's usually for the House, it's going to be something like scott.house.gov, or let's take, I don't have a representative because I live in DC, but my delegate, Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton would be, I think it's Holmes Norton or norton.house.gov. So just going through their website will give you a lot of information about their caucus and committee affiliations, as well as if there are any part of leadership positions. They will, you know, some members of Congress will also have just like tabs on like where they stand on certain issues. It's all pretty like, you know, in very broad terms, but they're helpful indicators of like, are they super progressive on this issue or are they more moderate? So definitely check out their actual websites. And then I said Congress.gov. And then sometimes I like to look at things like Ballotpedia or just any of those kind of like government tracking websites as well for information on people's district. Data.census.gov is big for understanding the makeup of a district. There's a walkthrough in the Know Your Legislator worksheet on how to use data.census.gov to find out population estimates for your district. So that's a really great resource as well. And I'm sure there are many others, but for the ones that I've just talked about, I'll absolutely be sure to share them with everybody after this. Okay. So Leangelo makes a really good point that Congressman Scott's district is Leangelo's district and the APIs there are just invisible. And that is the problem with some data. You know, this is why we want to advocate broad scale for like much better detailed data because, you know, it renders entire communities invisible. So thank you, Leangelo, for sharing that. Kathy asks, where's my mouse? Can you clarify again if federal government can control curriculum? If that's the case, what's the implications of Trump proposing a patriotic commission? Ooh, this is sticky. So the federal government cannot say what happens in curricula. So that's why that 1776 commission is like highly suspect and unusual. Curricula are decided at the local level. Yeah, federal government's just not supposed to touch it. CRAC is, I think, like going to release a statement on this at some point too, but definitely the fact that the president has created a commission to examine ethnic studies or unpatriotic like curricula in classrooms. I honestly think that, CRAC stance is definitely that's suspect. That is very, they just can't do that. So yeah. Oh, and Ismail actually, states set curriculum. Yes, states and districts set curriculum. And then Leangela asks, how much of strategizing is based on legislative research online versus talking to staffers and other stakeholders who have interfaced with reps? Strategizing is based on. So it's, both of them are, should be informing your strategy. For people who haven't really, for folks who don't have easy access to, say, like a member of Congress's staff, or even with that member, or just, let's say that, for example, in the time of COVID, when we can't exactly like walk into the halls of Congress and like ask for a meeting with a staffer, I would say that that's definitely hampering how much strategizing we could do based on personal relationships, based on actual experience, advocating in a policymaking space. But that is such a real thing, like definitely like for those of you seasoned advocates who have talked to staffers, who have relationships with them, that's absolutely something you should be building off of as well, and understanding what a staffer's priorities are, because they frequently do the work of, talking to a member and trying to get their member to support certain issues. And that's a really, really great point that you bring up, that, you could do legislative research online, but definitely that's more of a entry point into you starting to understand how you can frame your messages. Oops, all right. So I think that's all the questions in the chat box. Again, if you have further questions, please continue to use that. But what I'm going to do right now, actually, is kick it off to Gina to help us with the breakout rooms, so that you can practice on your own how to frame your messages. Let me think. Great. So, Gina, I have a question for you. If you could answer this. Could I keep this slide up as people are in breakout rooms, or does this slide go away?
Unfortunately, I think the slide will go away, but what we can do is feel free to just copy and paste this information into the chat box, and everyone should be able to see it.
Okay, great. Thank you. In that case, let me just read it out loud really quickly before we do breakout sessions. So I wanted you to try practicing making your pitch to a member of Congress, whether it's Congressman Scott or to another legislator that you did research on. I want you to practice advocating to your legislator why they should support disaggregating education data. Now, remember, you want to know your legislator's district, background, and policy priorities, and also know clearly what your ask is. What do you want them to do? Something very substantive, like increase funding for the AANAPISIS program, or I want you to disaggregate education data, X, Y, and Z. And then practice tailoring your message to appeal to your legislator. And with that, we're going to break it out, and what will happen is we'll end the breakouts at 6:55 or 6:45. I apologize. 6:47. We'll end at 6:47. So that's about 10 minutes to try practicing and all of this on your own. Cool. Gina?
Okay. Sorry, give me 1 second. Looks like some folks have been logging off, so I'll just readjust. Okay, opening all rooms in, well, now.
No. Okay. Oh, I don't need the slide. So actually what I have scheduled next, and we have about 5 minutes to do this, is actually ask for volunteer groups to like share out how you frame the issue of disaggregating education data for the legislator that you chose to really analyze and examine. Is my screen share ended? Great, thank you. I see heads nodding in the affirmative. All right, so yeah, let's see if anybody is brave enough to present to the rest of our small group here.
Can I start? If nobody.
Go for it.
Good. Thank you, my team leader, Mr. Roy, and also I met a few things. If you don't mind, my group, can I share what we discussed about it to the group? So basically, as a citizen of a great Long Beach area with community of Cambodian people, I'm quite concerned about the pandemic education, and my congressman is Congressman Lovento. He's quite advocate on Cambodian issue politically and socially with regard to my country, but also on the field of education, he's quite vocal, but to make sure that everybody get a fair share of treatment. But the issue is that during the pandemic time, all the school district, I'm talking, on Long Beach because this is what I'm aware. They focus a lot on safety. They focus a lot on security, everything, budget and everything. I'm concerned because my son now go to school. They never concerned about what expect outcome of the school. I don't have a chance to meet him lately, but I went to many of his staff, to also the school district too. But it's very concerning that during this time, we should mention what kind of curriculum we expect. Should we use the same curriculum? Should we add to it during the pandemic, or we call it emergency education? Because this affecting the output, the outcome, because all kids, we got to measure them by the skills and knowledge and also the impacts they're going to do. So with this in mind, I think Sirat also can, work with us on talking to some parents on how is this affecting our community in general. I think working online is we always tell our kids to not spend too much screen time, yet we focus more screen time. So it's very contradictory to the system and how we can create what they call a balance of screen time versus, play with a parent, play with a adult, or play with themselves. So I think Congressman Lovento, need to be aware of this kind of thing, and hope together, by putting all the big head together, we can find some workable solution for the benefit of all our children. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing the stories that are coming from your own experiences right now with the pandemic situation and the school shutdowns as a result. I think, I actually think that's like a great tie-in to this idea of disaggregated data and like pushing that to like your legislator too, because, and again, like, thank you so much for sharing that story. And in terms of like incorporating that into this like central ask of like, let's disaggregate data. I want to say that like, there's not a lot of like good data coming out of how students are being served during this distance learning time. I mean, there are individual stories that are coming out, like, news outlets are obviously writing articles upon articles, and certainly organizations like CRF, we're trying our best to like hear from community members in collective spaces about what's going on in their districts. But like, in terms of like data, like whether that's like, even just looking beyond the education space, like health data too, like there's not a lot of like detailed like numbers that we can point to about like what's going on. And you know, policymakers love hard numbers. They love seeing data, and they love seeing like communities like distilled down into numbers so they can make a decision. And that's terrible, but you know, because there are definitely human lives and stories to that. But I think that's a good case again for saying like, hey, member of Congress, like these are all the things. And you know, if we just had an infrastructure for better data, more detailed data at the federal level, we could know a whole lot more about how to serve our communities during distance learning. So I actually think that's like a great, like very timely and like relevant experience to tie like kind of another evergreen issue to, and just make it so much more relevant to your elected officials. So thank you so much for sharing out. There's actually a question from Audrey in the chat box that I wanted to address. Audrey asks if there's time for more questions. Well, for someone who's new to this, I guess like, you know, do you mean like, you know, I'll let Audrey, if you feel comfortable sharing out loud your question. If not, I can read it out loud too.
Yeah, sure. Basically, it's just new to really anything about policy, about even knowing who your legislators are and getting to know what they stand for, what they typically vote for or care about, and using that in advocacy work. And just basically, how do you get a read on them? Because even starting with, oh, they're part of these committees and caucuses, and that's already super helpful. And like, okay, you can get a read on, are they progressive, are they moderate, or something like that. But it's still super general. And I feel like the breakdown that you presented for Representative Scott was like a lot more in depth. And I'm just curious if you have any suggestions how to like really get that process going when we're like super new to it.
Absolutely. And I'm actually going to put one of my colleagues, Com, on the spot as well, if you have any further insights in terms of this question. But I think just taking time to like analyze their legislative history has been like a huge key for me. So Congress.gov is not like the most user-friendly of you know, like information clearinghouses, and definitely bill text can be very inaccessible, and I do want to acknowledge that. But to the extent that for major bills you're able to find you know, one-pager summaries, because very frequently members of Congress on their websites through a press release or committees will release like one-pagers and like fact sheets on like, you know, breaking down a big bill into like the substantive parts of it. Just really kind of like analyzing the legislation that a member of Congress has supported and pushed for or introduced. That's one way to kind of get a sense of like where the priorities are. And then Com, if you had any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think all members of Congress are each a little bit different, right? Like even the most hardcore conservative members of Congress and the most progressive members of Congress. And you can, like Anna said, get a sense of where their priorities are and where they might break from their party, or based on, you know, what type of industry is in their district or their state, based on the population makeup in their state. You can look at the bills that they previously co-sponsored to and get a sense of where their priorities might be. The other piece is looking at caucuses. So caucuses are like special affinity groups in Congress. They're not always official. Some of them are pretty informal. Like in the Senate, there was like a biking caucus, right? It wasn't even about biking policy. It's like a bunch of senators who just like to go biking together. And, you know, but it gives you an idea of like sort of what things might sway them. You know, Representative Alan Lowenthal is the chair of both the Cambodia and the Vietnam caucuses, both of which are bipartisan caucuses. And, you know, for some of those members, they might not come around on issues like Southeast Asian deportation, but you can get a sense that they may be more willing to talk about other issues that impact Vietnamese or Cambodian Americans because they're part of that caucus, right? So really a lot of this is looking at sort of every facet of that person. With regard, like you can look at their religion. When I first started lobbying, there was this lobbyist who would tell me that she'd bring like a Catholic priest to like this meeting with like this senator every single time she met with him, because she knew that he would listen to a priest, right? So, you know, it really is just about sort of looking at even the minute details of these individuals, like if they have children, Like that's always an easy angle, you know, like impact on children and families. So yeah, I mean, that's sort of the way that we look at it, both as like officially and then sort of like the unofficial stuff. And of course, organizations like CRAC and other national organizations that have direct relationships with congressional offices and their staff can also help feed information that we get from their staffers, right? Because a lot, you know, part of our job is to get to know these people in a formal but also informal manner and try to get information out of them that may be relevant to stakeholders. Like one of the questions that we often ask near the beginning of a Congress is, you know, what is your boss's angle for the year, right? Because each member of Congress generally will try to find like a pet issue or an angle for how they want to set themselves apart and sort of increase their profile.
Thank you, Kham, and thank you for that question, Audrey. So the time is 6:59. I know a couple more people had questions to ask, but again, I don't know if you can see my kitten in the background. So if you have any other questions, please absolutely email myself, anybody else that, you know, just email CRAC. Again, my email address is anna@crac.org. And after this training, we'll absolutely make sure to try to get to as many of your questions offline as possible. And with that, again, thank you all so much for taking the time on this Thursday evening to talk about federal policy and also just to like be witness to some incredible youth power and the youth leaders who joined us from Arise. I'm grateful for them for having been here to really just, you know, show us what youth power and community organizing could look like. And then hopefully y'all got a balanced kind of like perspective of like the ways in which education policy moves throughout all levels of government and how you can get involved as well. So thank you, Ahmad. Thank you again so much for joining us tonight. And I hope to see many of you during our immigration panel tomorrow as well. And you know what, I actually just I'm gonna share my screen one more time real quick. Huge thank you to the CRAC team as well, especially our folks who are up on TA. And so with that, have a good rest of your evening, and I hope this week has treated you kindly.